to the Friday sessions of the 2021 Gifted Education Policy Symposium and Conference. Thank you to our Emerald sponsors, the Colorado Association for Gifted and Talented, Gifted Unlimited, Gifted Unlimited's Talent Search, the Center for Gifted Studies at Western Kentucky University, and the World Council for Gifted and Talented Children. And our Ruby sponsors, the Colorado Academy of Educators for the Gifted, Talented, and Creative, JAH Educational Consulting, the National Association for Gifted Children, Rick Center for Gifted Children, Sierra Gifted Educational Services, and the G-Word Film. For today's panel, our first presenter is Dr. Theresa Newsom, followed by Dr. Joy Esquierdo, then Dr. Erin Robinson.
Hello, I'm Dr. Theresa Newsom, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here to share with you in regards to identification of gifted and talented students. We're looking at best practices, looking at equity and inclusion. Next, starting with Colorado, I'm looking at the different identification areas, and where you happen to be located, yours might be a little different because you may not be thinking about visual arts, performing arts, musical or psychomotor abilities. But the other areas, I believe, we're all on the same page. Next. Looking at our NAGC website, these are familiar tools and informational pieces for you to look at. I'm not going to read them to you, but being aware of what, how, and why we identify students in special populations, as well as all students who are gifted and talented, is important. And as we look at each of these numbers, and take your time and at a different time, think about what is our intent. It's so important for us to know that gifted children come in every fashion. They're identified from different populations. We look at SES, socioeconomic status. We look at culture. We look at gender ID. We look at the whole child. And when we do that, we will be looking intentionally for students who may not fit what we think should be a gifted student, but we're looking for those students who are underrepresented, who are gifted and need services. Next. As we're looking at the tools that would be used to identify students. And as many of you are aware, we use portfolios, and that's a collection of data using different bodies of evidence so that we see the whole child. Of course, we use the COGAT, the Naglieri, and the TOMAGs. We're familiar with those tools. We also use rating skills because we want parents to be involved. We want to have teacher input. And then there might be a coach or some other adult that sees this particular child from a different perspective, from a different lens. So we want to use rating scales so that we don't miss anything, because our intent is to identify gifted children. So we want a whole child perspective. We're also looking at performance. And we're going to observe ourselves. What are we seeing? Looking at local norms. We're also looking at equity in education, but also in gifted identification. This is an article written by several authors. And as you look at these norms in your local area, we want to ensure that we are doing universal screening. And then the norms that are local to our school district, our state, and of course, looking at NAGC's norms too. But the important thing about looking at the local norms is this is not a panacea. It's not going to be perfect. But when we look at the local norms, we're looking at the norms in that particular school district or in that school building. And when we're looking for high achievers, we're not comparing them to another state or another location. We're looking at the students who are high performers who could be identified gifted in that building. And so that may look a little different in another building. But if we're looking for the students in our particular school building, we're looking for the highest amongst that group of students. That's the beautiful thing about local norms, is that we're not comparing from one school to another school or our school district to a new school district. We are looking at the highest performing students in our own building. That's a little different for some people because we're thinking, oh, it's got to be a 95. It's got to be the 96. It might even be higher. But when we're looking for the highest performing students in our school building, it may look a little different. Next. So we start with our intent again, because that again is the root of how do we find the students? What's our purpose? What are we looking for? So when we're looking, we're talking about see me. If we're looking at students, they're going to look different. Okay. And I love this picture because it's such a diverse picture. It represents students from all walks and looks, and they have different characteristics. And so as we're starting the process, we're going to have an open mind, looking for students that we may not normally see. That's the beautiful thing about seeing students, is going beyond. We also want to understand. So we're going to understand students, we're going to support students, we're going to believe in those students because they need us to believe in them, because sometimes they don't believe in themselves. They don't think they qualify, or they don't think they belong. We want to make sure that they know that they belong in gifted education because we have found them. Teach me. That's another thing to consider. When we actually find our students and we identify our students who are gifted and talented, we also want to make sure we're teaching them at where they're at to expand and increase their knowledge, but also build upon the whole child, not just the academic piece of that. Okay, next. So when we see students, we're looking and knowing, because our intent is to understand and find students from all cultures, race, socioeconomic groups, and exceptionalities. Okay. So I want you to take just a moment and just kind of look at that picture. You might find a student that says, that student looks gifted, but how do we know who's not if we don't look and see them from a different perspective? Okay. Next. I want us to think about when we find students, we see them, do we understand them? Culture, identity, and intellect is so important, but culture for every student is a little different. It might be different from my culture. Culture is about my lived, breathed experiences. They're my history, they're my daily life. And so when I look at students and I think about their culture, do I really understand their culture? I know you're thinking, I can't understand everybody's culture, but if I take the opportunity to think about their culture might be a little different from mine, but I still look for their giftedness. I try to understand their culture and their values so that I can find those students, test those students, and enhance where they are. I'm thinking about their identity and intellect. I'm also looking at their language, their beliefs, their spirituality, their gender ID. Those are things that we sometimes don't think about when we're looking for students to identify. And we just need to be aware, again, that those are part of their whole giftedness. And with their whole giftedness, we need to include those aspects of their personality and their characteristics. We do look at the socio-emotional needs of gifted students. We support them. But again, looking at the bullets on the top and in the middle, we need to also make sure we support them that way. We're also looking for our 2E students, also identified as twice exceptional. Just because I may not be able to do everything physically doesn't keep me from my intellect from happening. I worked in a school system. I was a principal at one time of students who were deaf and hard of hearing. And I had some pushback when I wanted to assess a student who had hearing loss. And I didn't understand why I had the pushback. I said, their brain works. Their hearing may not be at full capacity, but their intellect is still there. So again, using that growth mindset, our twice exceptional children may have an exceptionality, but their intellect is there. Their culture is there. Their identity is there. We need to understand it, support, and teach. And again, that support includes the socio-emotional needs. Let's look past student achievement scores and let's dig a little deeper on that, looking for the whole child. Next. As we're digging deep, let's think about the environment that the students that we are looking for are in. It may not be an environment that we're accustomed to. It may not be something we understand necessarily or we agree with. But again, as we're identifying students, we're looking at the whole child. And when we do that, we want to have a supportive system. We want to affirm and continue to reaffirm their value, their culture, their intellect, their socio-emotional needs. So I'm going to pause for a moment so you can look at this chart without me talking. Safe spaces are truly important for our gifted learners. But before they are identified gifted, we need to make sure they're in a safe place so they can become and perform in the way that gives them the pathway to become a whole gifted child. Next. Educational equity means that each child receives what he or she needs to develop to his or her full academic and social potential. As we identify gifted children from all walks, we want to make sure that we are there to support, create safe spaces, give them an opportunity to be heard, and let them be who they are, and so they can become who they should be as they grow and develop as a gifted, identified student. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Joy Esquierdo. I am a professor at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, deep South Texas, right at the tip of Texas. And I will be speaking to you about advocating for underserved bilingual gifted students. And so in this short presentation, I really want to hopefully explore with you different variety of perspectives and expectations that we have for gifted and talented bilingual students with diverse backgrounds. And when we talk about bilingual students, there's many labels that come with this, and I will talk about that as we go through the slides. But being bilingual comes in different levels of language development, different languages, various backgrounds, diverse backgrounds, like Theresa mentioned earlier, SES, different levels of SES. Even within that aspect, there's different variances, looking at different cultural experiences. Many times those cultural experiences are connected to SES, are connected to linguistic backgrounds. And so all of that coming into play. And then also talking about the necessity of genuine partnerships between the educational stakeholders is very important as we advocate for the underserved bilingual gifted students. When you think about the partnerships between the GT office and the bilingual office in your district. So how much communication happens between these two offices? When they work together, are they working together to pull in, to identify, to effectively serve our bilingual gifted students? I have seen some experiences where sometimes they counter, where a bilingual child's identified gifted, and then comes the debate: do we, provide them bilingual services, or do we provide them gifted services? And that just kind of shows that there may be more of a need of building that partnership between the different offices and within a district. And also educational stakeholders includes the teacher, right? Because many times the teacher is the first step in this, and the parents, right? Because the parents also is an educational stakeholder, probably one of the most important educational stakeholders in the child's life. And then how, after we begin to identify students, then how do we effectively serve them in a respectful, meaningful way, that respects, like Theresa was mentioning earlier, their cultural experiences as well. And then having this constant advocacy is very necessary to begin and sustain this change in our schools. We've seen the numbers, that really show the underrepresentation of our bilingual gifted students. And as we begin to advocate for this change, it's very important that we continue to have these conversations to sustain these types of changes. Okay, next. And so the purpose here is really begin to recognize and study the reasons for the significant underrepresentation of Latinx bilingual students and gifted and talented programs. So recognize them, analyze them, begin to break it down, and find different ways of how we can address those reasons. And the necessity to have a shared definition of giftedness for bilingual students specifically, and understand those unique characteristics. And going back from connecting all those educational stakeholders. So looking at parents, do parents understand those unique characteristics of their bilingual gifted students? Teachers, many teachers, use a checklist. And within that checklist, does it include those unique characteristics of bilingual gifted students, especially in schools that have a significant number of bilingual students? I know across I'm in Texas, so across Texas, but even across the nation, the number of bilingual students in our schools is increasing rapidly. Are we prepared for that? Have we been really thinking about how we can serve those gifted students within that population? And then necessity to have a clear identification process. A colleague and I did a study looking at different matrices in different districts, and looking how each district so uniquely has a very unique identification process for gifted students. So how can we have that very clear, right? So parents really understand how that process happens. Teachers really understand, the process of identification. So that's very clear for everybody, and then they know what steps to follow. Next. So I want to start here with what leads to the underrepresentation of bilingual students in our GT programs. And I'm going to take a little time with this graph here, although it seems pretty simple. So we think about first the definition of giftedness. And so I'll in a few slides, I will talk about, actually in the next slide, about the definition of giftedness. But you think about the definition national, state, and then local, right? So how does that definition align? And not only the definition that we're using, because we'll see the national definition, and then depending on where you are in the state, and then each district, sometimes they have their own definition. But then you also think about the interpretation of the definition. So how are the educators that are one of the first steps in identifying students for gifted programs, what do they think is a definition of giftedness? And then the next thing to think about is we may have a very inclusive definition of giftedness, but maybe our identification process is very conservative. So is there an alignment? So having people think about what's the alignment between the definition that we adopt for our district, for our school, and our state, and then does that process for identification align to that? So Theresa mentioned, being inclusive, using local norms, right? So you have a very inclusive definition of giftedness, you would consider those local norms, but do we do that in the identification process, right? So making sure that there's a nice alignment between the definition and the process. And many times as we've studied this, we've noticed that the definitions, they can be more inclusive of different types of giftedness. But then when you think about the identification process, they're very restrictive to standardized assessments only, not including portfolios, not including interviews. And so then the process itself becomes very conservative. And then the impact of bilingual programs. So we're trying to capture gifted bilingual students. Let's look at what kind of programs, bilingual programs, our schools offer, right? Are those programs additive? Are they subtractive? Are they affirming? Do they have a deficit view of the bilingual students? What kind of program does our school implement, and how does that impact the students' ability to express their giftedness? And I'll explain that a little bit more as we go through some of the slides. And then also understanding, giftedness in bilingual students. So again, going back to understanding those unique characteristics of giftedness in our bilingual students. And then once we identify them, how do we service them, right? And so then it comes into how we service them. I know some of the challenges some schools face, like I mentioned earlier, is that we can identify a bilingual gifted student, then becomes a challenge of when we service them, sometimes we hold them back because they still need to develop more English. And their English levels are not ready, they're not up to par to then be ready to go into a gifted classroom. So we're really advocating to have our bilingual teachers be GT certified, right? And that they understand how to service also our gifted students, so that then they don't have to make a choice so many times. Sometimes parents are put in situations where they have to choose between a bilingual program and a gifted program. So when we really understand giftedness in bilingual students, then we begin to not have those type of challenges, because then we really understand how that is fostered. And these three things tend to really be the bigger factors that lead to that underrepresentation of bilingual gifted students in our schools. Okay, next. And so the national definition of giftedness, as you can see here, and I'm not going to read it to you, but it can be pretty inclusive. You have different types of giftedness. You see here, that shows evidence. It doesn't really talk about what type of evidence. So then the schools can interpret that as qualitative, as quantitative. So it can be very inclusive when we look at the national definition of giftedness by the U.S. Department of Education. Next. And here I'm showing you an example of the Texas definition of giftedness. I know many of the participants here, most if not all, are from Colorado, but I wanted to show you an example of an inclusive definition when most of the matrices used to identify gifted students are still very conservative. So here we have a great definition of giftedness in the state of Texas, and I highlighted some keywords here that it describes giftedness as a possibility even to show potential. So they may not show it yet, but they have the potential to show, performing at remarkably high levels. And then here we talk about those local norms, right? When compared to others of the same age, experience, and environment. And that's very important to have there. I know Theresa, spent some time in talking about the importance of local norms. And so the Texas definition of giftedness does reference that, right? Does include and have schools think about, when you're looking at a child, how does this child compare to others that have that same experience, that have the same cultural experience, that have the same SES experience, that have the same, linguistic experience, life experiences, family experiences, academic experiences. How do they compare to others, right? Within their local norms. And that's very important to have. So the Texas definition, going back to, is very inclusive. And it's actually, I'm very proud of how Texas has crafted their definition. The challenge comes because even in Texas, when 52% of the population is Latinx, we still have a significant underrepresentation of bilingual Latinx students in gifted programs. Is the process of identifying them. So going back to what I said earlier, there's this mismatch of the definition that's very inclusive to the process being very conservative. Next. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the reasons for the significant underrepresentation of the marginalized group, especially bilingual students. If you think about deficit, how many people, when they think of Latinos, like Latinx people, the Latinx population, I know in the country, they're mainly referred to as Hispanic. So the Hispanic population, many times they're even referred to just as Mexican, right? The Mexicans. If you think of politically, that has, for many people, for a very negative a very negative take, right? It's been used very negatively. Those Mexicans, these Mexicans, the Mexican kids, and even just referring to bilingual students, right? Oh, those are the bilingual kids. No, that's for bilingual kids. Well, the bilingual kids can't really do that. And so there tends to be this deficit thinking of the population in general. So having to address that, right? First, how do we think of the bilingual population, of the Latinx student population? How does our school celebrate the bilingualism, of our students? How do we celebrate the cultural, experiences of our students? So moving away from this deficit thinking and then looking more into that asset-based thinking, right, for our students. And then we just look at labels. For many, many, many years, we referred to our bilingual students as limited English proficient. So they were called LEP, right? Our LEP population, our LEP kids. And so just that limited English proficient, the word limited. So just by the way we were labeling them, we started off with they're limited, right? So it's not that they have the gift of being bilingual or they have the skill of being bilingual, but that they were limited in English, right? So they could be very strong above level in their native language, but they're limited in English. Right. So it's a very deficit way of thinking of our bilingual students. We have moved into the next label they have moved into was the English language learner. So literature still refers to them. Some of our government documents still refer to our bilingual students as limited language learner. I'm sorry, English language learners. But then the focus really becomes English language, right? And our students in school are learning more than just English language. So then it's moved into English learners. Right, they're learning content in English, right? So English learners, it's a little broader than English language learners, but the focus still remains that they need to learn English, right? So it's still very narrow, and not really celebrating that students come to school with a language. They have a home language. We're adding English to their linguistic repertoire, right? We're adding English to the linguistic skills they already come to school with. So they are being an emergent bilingual. They're emerging to be bilingual. And that's the term I want us to begin to think about because it begins to celebrate their bilingualism. The next term after that I've been using in some of the literature I've been writing is referring to them as bilingual learners. These are learners that are bilingual at whatever level that may be. Right? They may be beginning bilingual, they may be intermediate bilingual, they may be advanced bilingual, but we're again celebrating their bilingualism and not just focusing on their English. And this is very important as we talk about their giftedness, because you think of the school, if the teacher, we're just focused on what they can communicate to us in English, then a child that comes in with a different native language may not have the opportunity to express him or herself, express and communicate all that the child understands and their unique ideas and their creative ways of solving a problem. They're not able to communicate that because all we're really looking at or measuring or valuing is their English development. So these labels are very important because of that. And then using the term like language barriers, right? And so they have a language barrier. And so we're really talking about or considering their home language as a barrier instead of as an asset. And so then the types of bilingual programs in our school are very important as it begins to set the context of the student to then look at and see how their giftedness manifests in the classroom. Next. So I'm going to briefly talk about these bilingual programs. So if you look at one side, it's asset-based additive enrichment models. So these are the programs that from the beginning are developing both languages together. So you have the one-way dual language and a two-way dual language. And those two, if you look in the bottom, is first language plus the second language, and that leads for them to be bilingual learners. On the other side, which these are most commonly used in our schools, is transitional late exit program, bilingual program, transitional early exit bilingual program, and ESL pullout. And those type of programs are more need-based, they're more remedial, they're more subtractive. So a child comes in with a native language, this is L1, the school adds English and we subtract the native language. So the child just becomes an English student, right? We transform that child into a monolingual English student. And so this is very important if you think of the context of the classroom. So when we ask teachers, does this child stand out in the classroom? Well, if their native language is other than English, then more likely they may not be as talkative in the classroom because the expectation is English. Next. And so these characteristics, I'm not going to spend too much time here, but these characteristics of giftedness have been identified by the HBGSI. And so if you want more information on these 11 clusters, you can go to teachbilingual.com. And it has all the literature and the instrument itself. But these 11 clusters have been identified of being the unique characteristics of bilingual gifted students. I want to highlight one in particular, which is collaboration. So many of bilingual gifted students show their giftedness by collaborating, which is very opposite. They're not as competitive. In fact, they'd rather, they kind of have this mother hen characteristic where they want to help others also perform like they do. They want others to understand like they do. So they tend to be like the tutor and really bring in that team leader skill. And so there's others that can be different, can even sometimes counter the mainstream giftedness. And so it's important to really understand these unique characteristics of bilingual gifted students. Next.
Five minutes remaining.
Okay, thank you. So I'll spend, okay, if I have 5 minutes, I thought I had less time, so I'll spend a little more time here. And so another thing I want to highlight here is the familial. So when you think of a bilingual gifted student, they tend to have this family type approach to learning, right? So again, going back to that group setting, wanting to communicate, wanting to talk, wanting to bring in others. They sometimes, and these are just generalizations because they're just overall characteristics of this group. They again, going back to trying to be this mother hen in a classroom. So they can kind of stand out that way. And I also want to highlight the social and academic language. So when you think about the child being able to demonstrate their linguistic skills in the classroom with that social or academic language, if the classroom itself is more of an English only classroom, or it's in a transitional, even if it's a transitional bilingual program, but it's already in second year, so the teacher's really focusing on pushing them into an English classroom, then the Spanish language is not being fostered, it's not being developed. And the gifted child going to locus of control, which is on the other side of that, one of the other clusters, they tend to be very sensitive to the expectations of like external locus of control and internal locus of control. And so when they are very sensitive to the external locus of control, the expectations of the classroom, and they notice and they sense that the teacher is really valuing English and not so much valuing Spanish, or the instruction has no focus on Spanish, then they won't really showcase that. And so when that happens, the teacher really misses out on what the child really understands in the classroom and what the child really can perform, right? Because that Spanish is not included in the instruction. So that goes back to my previous slide of the importance of what kind of bilingual program does our school implement, and does that program celebrate the bilingualism of our students? So then we can begin to see these 11 clusters really shine in the classroom. Next. And so my recommendations here is notice that our use of the descriptors of our bilingual students. What kind of descriptors do we use? Are we still using LEP? Do we use L, like the EL? What kind of descriptors are we using? Are we celebrating their bilingualism by using descriptors like emergent bilinguals? Are we calling them bilingual students and really celebrating that skill set that they bring into our classroom? And beginning to shift from that deficit system to an asset-based system, starting with the language, experiences, the cultural experiences, even looking at their SES experiences. I talk to teachers a lot about how can we help students bridge their home experiences to school expectations? Because for many middle class, upper class students, their home experiences tend to be much more aligned to school expectations. And for other students in SES, we really have to help teachers and students bridge that for them, right? Because those experiences are very valuable. How do we bring them into the classroom and connect our instruction to their home experiences as well? So shifting from that deficit to that asset base, looking at that community wealth, and taking advantage of the inclusiveness of our definition of giftedness. So if in your district, your definition is very inclusive, well, then how can we align the matrix that we use to identify our students to that definition, by taking advantage of that inclusiveness? And collaborating with parents and helping parents really understand the unique characteristics of giftedness, and having parents and teachers partner through activities like a community learning exchange, where we learn from parents of how do parents identify giftedness? How do they define what is giftedness to them? And then how can we, bring together their understanding of giftedness and then the school's understanding of giftedness, and provide training on these unique characteristics for our Latinx gifted bilingual students. Training for our teachers, training for administrators, training again for the community, for our parents, so we can have a better understanding of these unique characteristics. Thank you.
Thank you, Theresa, and thank you, Joy, and thank you to everyone here. I'm Erin Robinson from the Jody Mahoney Center at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and I'm pleased to share with you my thinking and some of our work with respect to talented children and adolescents from low-income households. And I have to call out, because our audience is very heavily from Colorado, that I'm actually a fourth generation Wyoming girl from just north of Cheyenne, but have lived the last 30 years here in Little Rock, Arkansas. So I'm happy to be with you. So this afternoon, what I'd like to do is to share some thought-provoking facts about the scope of poverty in the US, because it helps to put into context the magnitude of the challenge. And gifted education professionals need to access all the tools at their disposal to identify talents and sustain them among poor children and adolescents. So secondly, I'd also like to share examples of the work that we've been doing, because I don't like to only complain. I would like to offer some solutions. So share some examples of the work we have been doing for the last 15 years on school interventions that work with young, underserved, gifted children. And I'll focus primarily on what we've learned about talent spotting and where we're headed in our newest project funded by the US Department of Education, a Javits project called STEM plus C squared, where the C squared stands for creativity times computer science. And then third, so that you're not wondering whether there's a way to capture some of the resources I'm going to refer to, there will be citations and links to key resources in the last couple of slides that will be available to you following this panel, so that you can have access beyond the panel. It's work that we've done, but it's also key resources that have informed our work. So could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So we will start with the problem. There's no getting around it. My specific brief today is to address the issue of poverty and talent. And this is a problem that's beyond schools, but nevertheless, we just can't back away from trying our best. We have to soldier on. But the context is that in the US, income inequality is widespread. It's been exacerbated and laid bare by the pandemic, but it's always been there. So the startling statistic about income inequality in this country is that 99% of all the wealth in the US is held by the richest 1% of the populace. And that's probably a conservative estimate. It fluctuates, but it might be even more like 1/10 of 1% of the populace. Well, to put a technical term to it, yikes. With that kind of income inequality, it's inevitable that too many children will live in poverty. Now, the rates, the second facet to this problem, the rates of child poverty, which had actually been dropping over several decades in the US, have actually increased precipitously in the last year. It's hard to get the 2020 income child poverty stats from the US Census Bureau yet, which is the place to go. But in any event, it has dropped in the last. I mean, it has increased. Child poverty has increased, and it doesn't take much to figure that out. So the way to think about this problem is that the disproportionality with respect to children from low-income households sadly allows us to paint with a very, very broad brush. It affects millions of children, millions of children. Poverty is an important variable for us to put squarely in the frame in terms of the cultivation and identification of talents. So that's the problem. Please advance to the next slide. Okay, so what might that problem look like in the context of a low-income state? I live in a low-income state. And I live in a low-income state that has policies to identify giftedness inclusively and to serve students K-12 with advanced services. So that's the context. Low-income state, policies in place to identify, policies in place to serve K-12. So here's some data that we have looked at currently in Arkansas, because we have it all here. We have urban poverty that is disproportionately African-American. We have rural poverty that is both African-American and white. And we have a community of Marshallese that is beset with poverty. And we are increasingly seeing a Latinx population in the state of Arkansas. So let's look at these two pie charts because they tell the tale. These are data from a statewide analysis of children in grade 3. That's the grade at which this state traditionally formally identifies gifted students as students so that the services that follow funding can be accorded to schools. And here's what these two pies show us. The pie chart on the left of your screen shows that 13% of third graders are identified as gifted through traditional but inclusive practices, okay? The state statutory definition of giftedness in this particular low-income state is that of Joe Renzulli's. So it's an inclusive definition. And furthermore, the identification rules and regs in the state include multiple criteria, include building level identification committee involvement, and include cautionary regulation that no single indicator can be used to exclude a child from services. Okay, so think about that. And now shift to the right pie, and here you can see that 6% of grade 3 children from low-income households are identified as gifted through traditional but inclusive practices. In other words, if you come from a low-income household, you are half as likely to be identified for gifted education services. That's disproportionality. Okay. So now, can I advance the slide to the next one, please? Thank you. So although this is a panel on identification, my perspective and the work that's been done at the Mahoney Center for the past decade and a half has been about what needs to be in place to aspire to more equitable services. Our model is built on the premise that the curriculum is the platform for talent development. And we operationalize that conceptual model by intervening early, by ensuring that children from low-income households are exposed to novel tasks. And we've had excellent results using novel tasks from engineering and science domains, particularly engineering. And performance on these novel tasks reveal fewer excellence gaps than do the reading and mathematics content domains, more prevalent in classrooms and therefore more prevalent in gifted education services. Okay. So I'm going to come back to this slide, but I know it's within our capability to advance one and come back. So can we have the next slide, please? All right, so I just wanted you to see examples of novel tasks, what we're talking about here. These are the kinds of novel tasks embedded in a curriculum to develop talents. And they've been effective at reducing gaps for us in our early interventions. Now I'm focusing on poverty today, but they've been effective in reducing some other gaps as well. On the left, we see one half of an engineering team designing a plant package. And that's supposed to keep that plant alive when it's shipped. Can you kind of see it there? It's really made out of a milk carton. So that's a materials engineering task, okay? That would keep, that other half of that team isn't in this photo, but that was a plant shared through a joint custody agreement between the two engineers. One took the plant home one weekend, the other plant parent had custody the next weekend. So it was an adorable, extended, novel task by these two young women who were involved in an engineering curriculum with novel tasks. The photo on the right captures another novel task in a curriculum unit on acoustical engineering. Now, these two grade 1 engineers are learning about damping sound. Joy, could I ask you to go back one slide so I can make my final point? Thank you. What's happening here is that the use of novel tasks within engineering, which is generally unfamiliar, whether you come from a home where you're receiving a school meal subsidy status, i.e. a low-income household, or a more affluent home, the general unfamiliarity of children in both these groups means that the novel task leveled the playing field. So we saw fewer gaps, i.e. more equitably distributed talent observation. Okay, so let's go through our two sets of engineers and fetch up into slide 7, Joy. Thank you. All right, so if you were able to join the opening policy panel last evening, you would have heard several panelists, and you heard both Theresa and Joy talk about the promising identification practice of universal screening coupled with the use of local or building level norms. So let's take a look at what this tool did for us in the real world with respect to increasing the size of the talent pool. Again, as a part of a Javits project, we're looking at statewide data from a mathematics accountability test given to grade 1 students in 2019. That's pre-pandemic. We didn't test in 2020, so we have no 2020 data. And the column on your far left, yes, are data which indicate the percent of students who identify as African American statewide, that's 18.8%. The percent of students who identify as Hispanic or Latinx, that's 16.2%. And the percent of students who receive a meal subsidy, that's a whopping 58.9%. In other words, in this context, 2 out of 3 children in this grade level statewide live in poverty. Okay, so if we want to think productively about talent spotting among children from low-income households, then let's look at the bottom row. Let's imagine that we wish to serve the top 10% of children. If we do so using state norms, about 31% of the kids we located would be from low-income homes. That's about half the number of kids from low-income homes in the full statewide sample.
5 minutes remaining.
Thank you. Shift a column to your right and you see what happens when Jill sliced the data in another way. She looked at what happens when we use district norms. And we have small rural districts, large urban districts, suburban districts. And now that we see our district norms will increase the proportion of children from low-income households who score in the top 10% of their district from 31% to 40%. Okay, and finally, if you shift one more column to the right, you see what happens at the local or school building level. Now we see that the disproportionality is once again addressed. We move from 40% to 46%. With each different referent or norm group, the children whose school experience, after all, is at the building level become increasingly able to access services. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. Here's another way to look at what happens when we pay attention to universal screening and local norms. What these data show are that the use of a first grade accountability test in either mathematics or English language arts to understand how it might find students who are scoring at the top 10% in their buildings. So for a baseline, let's look at the bar and the pie chart that are in that kind of apricot color at the left of your slide. It represents the number of children in the state who were identified by grade 3 through traditional but inclusive means. We call them gifted by multiple criteria. And if you look at the apricot pie chart, you can see that about half of those students in this context come from low-income households because they're eligible for meal subsidies. Sounds pretty good, right? But take into account the note at the bottom of this slide. 69% of all grade 3 children, or approximately 7 out of 10 children, are poor. That's disproportionality. Now let's take a look at the gray bar. That's the one in the middle. Here we see that by using local norms, we find that in buildings across the state, the top 10% of children on a traditional accountability test in either mathematics or language arts were not identified for gifted and talented services. Let me say that again. These are the highest scoring kids and they were not identified through inclusive means, all right? And they are disproportionately poor. Of those 4,146 children who were the highest achievers in their schools, 58.2% of them were receiving a meal subsidy. I like to think of it this way. If we do just simple addition, rather than 1,852 students receiving services, 6,998 grade 3 students should be receiving advanced academic services of some kind. If you want to serve children from low-income households more equitably, get a bigger slice of a bigger pie. Now that's an infrastructure inequality, not only an identification inequality. Many more kids would receive services and about half of the disproportionality gap would be closed. So let's go to our last slide here.
2 minutes remain.
Thank you. 2 minutes? I think I heard that. The equation for success. Let's look at the takeaway message. What worked for us over 15 years of developing an intervention model for finding and sustaining talent in children? It isn't all about identification. Several elements are necessary to construct an equation for success. Expose children in low-income classrooms to novel tasks. Provide challenging curriculum access, preferably in content domains that are hands-on and take advantage of their life experiences. Engineers are always solving problems under constraints. Poor children are always living with constraints. And of course, you work with the teachers. Help them spot talented performance when they see it as children engage in novel tasks. In one of our studies, we found this increased referral rates for both African American and poor kids. Implement universal screening without busting the budget. That's why we worked with the existing accountability tests rather than administering something additional. Poor schools can't afford it. And use local norms because whoever is achieving at the top in the school needs advanced services. Using all these strategies did minimize achievement gaps for us across multiple interventions at multiple sites, documented through multiple studies. In the next 2 slides, which I'll have Joy move to, you would see something you come back to later. They're resources that you can consult and follow up on. They're ones that informed us, and they're also ones that describe in more detail the work that we've done. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you. And now I'll turn it back over to our moderator.
Well, thank you so much, Anne. This has been a wonderful session, and I really appreciate all of this information. So thank you to our incredible presenters and our audience. And up next at 2 p.m., we have Critical Conversations with Mr. Ken Dixon.